A welcome to everybody here. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Janine Kirby, and I'm currently the chairperson of Mbuyiselo. And it's really wonderful to welcome you all to the second of our learning forums, and that so many of you are joining us, and that we're joining together in this community that we're creating. Just a bit of admin before we start is that you'll see that this is being recorded. We hope that we'll be able to upload it onto the Mbuyiselo website later, but just so that all of you are aware of that, we're going to be recording it in speaker view in case any of you are concerned around privacy issues. Also to remind you that this meeting is free to all of you who have joined as Mbuyiselo professional members, and I'm really delighted to tell you that we already have over 100 of you, and our numbers are growing continually. And for those of you who aren't Mbuyiselo members, is that we do ask for a donation of 150 Rand, and I'm sure that you've been in contact with Lynn about that, as well as we welcome all of those who've requested a bursary, would like to join us, but were unable to pay. And so I hope that you'll really enjoy this very important session. And over to you, Barbs.
Thanks, Janine. Thank you. And just a warm welcome to everyone. And I just always love seeing old friendly faces and new faces on the screen. And it's a real privilege for me to be here this evening with my two other panelists, Pete Milligan and Mbuyiselo Yanta. And we've had two lovely meetings to get ready for today. And I'm looking forward to sharing some of the things that we've been thinking about and exploring amongst ourselves. And so as indicated in the invitation, is that the three of us will be having a conversation and just sharing some of our own thoughts and our own stories and experience with the area of mindfulness around the very important area of trauma. And I mean, today in South Africa, we have, we live with trauma on a day-to-day basis, and globally it's exploding, and the levels of trauma. And so, we can't not become more trauma aware or trauma informed in the work that we do, particularly in our field of mindfulness. So today we're going to be looking at sort of three aspects. Mbuyiselo, Pete, and I'll introduce you to them now. We'll just look at the three aspects, and Pete will be touching in on how does trauma affect the body, at a physiological level, at a biological level. So he'll share all his experience on that, and knowledge and wisdom. And then Mbuyiselo will speak to his experience in community and community settings and the nature of collective trauma and historical trauma. And then I will speak to being trauma informed in our practice, and as we either teach or in our own personal practices, and what does it look like and feel like to be more trauma informed, and also what happens when we aren't, which is actually sometimes quite it wakes me up quite a lot when I suddenly realize I thought I was and then I wasn't. But before we get on, I'd like to just share with you a little bit about Pete and Mbuyiselo, my two fellow panelists. So first of all, Mbuyiselo lives in Cape Town, in one of South Africa's largest townships of Khayelitsha. And he's passionate about working with youth and supporting them in shifting their limiting mindsets. And Mbuyiselo has completed an advanced organizational relationship systems coaching, as well as the Alchemy course, which is the art and science of co-facilitation. And he's also completed foundation training in African family constellations. And he's a director of Mbuyiselo. So welcome, Mbuyiselo. There you are. Great. There's Mbuyiselo over there. And then Pete Milligan, who I've met many, many, many years ago. Gosh, I don't even want to say how many. I think it was in 1998. So it's a long time ago. And Pete is a psychiatrist, and he has nearly 20 years of experience in using mindfulness interventions in therapeutic settings. And he also leads mindfulness wilderness trails and mindfulness programs for healthcare workers. And he's currently based in Northern KZN with Jill, his wife, where he's involved in mental health services for rural communities. And he's also director of AMISA. So welcome, Pete. And then I'll welcome myself. There's Pete, there's waving there to us. And then just a little bit about myself. I'm based here in East London together with Janine, and I work here as a psychologist. And Janine and I together have been co-facilitating mindfulness-based stress reduction since about 2007. I'm also currently on the teaching faculty of the Stellenbosch 2-year program in mindfulness-based interventions, and also look after and train mindfulness-based supervisors in mindfulness-based supervision. So welcome me. Hello, everyone. So there we go. And so I'm going to, without further ado, hand over to Pete. And what we're going to be doing is each one of us will share our thoughts and feelings and our experiences on the section that we're going to cover. We're going to share about 10 minutes or so, and then Pete and then the other two panelists will have a conversation. So first we will start with Pete, and he's going to be talking about how trauma works in the body. And once he's finished his input, then Mbuyi and I will have a conversation together with Pete. And then we'll follow the same format, moving into Mbuyi sharing on his experience of the historical trauma in this country and collective trauma. And then I will come in at the end, looking at what does trauma-informed feel like, look like, and what happens when we don't do it. And then there will be time for question and answers at the end. So let's just, first of all, just take a moment to pause and arrive in this setting, in this space, both within your own room at home, but also awareness of being in the wider room, this AMISA room. So just finding your own way to a place that you can feel gathered and settled. And taking a deeper than normal in-breath, perhaps stretching your arms up, if that's comfortable for you, and just sighing the breath out, and maybe just doing a little bit of a wriggle and a shake, and settling back down. And we'll be handing over to you, Pete.
Great, thanks, Barbara, and greetings, everyone. It's really good to see some familiar faces, and also, of course, plenty of new faces. Greetings from Northern KZN. I wanted to, before I talk about trauma in the body, just, if I could, make two disclaimers, which I think are important. And I think the first is just to say that talking about trauma can be traumatic. So just give yourself permission to be kind to yourself, particularly if something comes up this evening that for you is in some way triggering or evocative or perhaps difficult for you. So just give yourself permission to be kind to yourself. And then the second is that while I'm going to be talking about some trauma mechanisms, which I hope will help us all to be more trauma-informed in our mindfulness interventions, I'm not going to be talking about trauma therapy or the various evidence-based therapeutic interventions for trauma. That's a topic of another conversation. What we're really trying to do here is to raise awareness about trauma, and in particular, the interface between engaging in mindfulness-based interventions with participants who may have a history of trauma and what might arise in the process, rather than trying to advise on the treatment of trauma itself, which, as I say, will be the subject of another conversation sometime. So just to kick us off, I wanted to start with my own story, and that was way back in the early 2000s when I was consultant in charge of the therapeutic unit at Lentegeur Hospital in Mitchell's Plain down on the Cape Flats. And we had been exploring opening a dialectical behavioral therapy program for patients on our inpatient therapeutic program. And around that time, I'd been introduced to mindfulness practice. I was fresh out of my first MBSR, so really keen. And I still remember one day we ran lots of groups on the ward, launching into a very short 5 minutes awareness of breath exercise. And within literally a minute or two, the woman sitting opposite me completely froze. And it became apparent that just in those few minutes of stillness and silence, she'd somehow got in touch with some very deep trauma. And I won't give you all the details, but it really was a wake-up call for me, that something as brief as a mindfulness-based practice lasting a minute or two could plunge someone back into really quite distressing re-experiencing of her trauma. So that was my wake-up call. So I want to use that just as a backdrop to saying a little bit more about trauma. And I'm going to avoid being too technical. I'm also going to avoid a lot of detailed neuroscience. And I also was told I have only 10 minutes, so that'll save you as well. So let me begin by saying that the trauma has many meanings. So some people like to talk about big T trauma and little t trauma. So trauma is part of everyday life would be little t trauma. I get home and I tell my partner, you know what she said or he said, or this is what happened to me today. But what we're really talking about this evening largely is big T trauma, trauma that is overwhelming. And I'm going to say a little bit more about what I mean by that. But of course, the boundaries are blurred because, in fact, if you have suffered significant trauma, particularly early childhood trauma, then even so-called little t trauma may take on a disproportionate significance for you. So when we experience threat, the brain responds in a kind of a progressive way. So the first is really just anxiety. We feel anxious. And we all have some sense, I think, of where we feel that anxiety in the body. As the trauma escalates, we may become fearful. We may sometimes respond with anger to the trauma as a result of that fear. As it increases, we may feel the urge to run, or the urge, if you like, to fly, to get away, to get out. If we feel stuck or trapped, we may feel the urge to fight back, to defend ourselves, to protect ourselves. But sometimes when the trauma is really overwhelming, we just freeze because we can't go anywhere. And we're trapped in a sense of awe and horror, perhaps a sense of impending doom, and an inability to escape. So with milder forms of trauma, we often have full recall and we can narrate all the details, what we call declarative memory. So I can come home and offload to my friend or partner, you know what happened to me today, and so on. But with more severe trauma, and particularly the kind of trauma leading to what I've just described when I use that word freeze, when the individual is trapped in that sense of awe, horror, impending doom, our memory seems to split into sensory fragments. So it's a little bit like, do you remember the old freeze frame in the movies? So it's a bit like a movie clip rolling along, and then suddenly there's a point at which the freeze happens and the trauma becomes overwhelming, and there's this sense of I'm going to die, or something absolutely dreadful is happening, and perhaps I can't get out or get away. And what happens then is that our memory splits into sensory fragments. So just to give you one example, in a trauma patient who'd been in a motor vehicle accident, they said, it was that moment when I heard the squealing tires and I knew we were going to crash, that I froze. You can just imagine that kind of freeze frame, that kind of clip, just that sound bite, if you like. And so memory fragments under intense trauma into these sensory components: sounds, images, smell. Smell is particularly evocative when it comes to memory. Taste, of course, touch, and of course in the body itself. So people who've experienced trauma may hold that trauma within their body. One of the best-known neurophysiologists of the last 20 or 30 years is Bessel van der Kolk, and he wrote a very famous paper in the mid-90s called The Body Keeps the Score, really just talking about how trauma is somatized and how trauma is held within the body. And so while people who suffered extreme trauma may have these sensory fragments of memory, very often their declarative memory or their ability to recall is impaired. And so they're only able perhaps to recall part of the experience, or perhaps only the events leading up to the freeze with no memory of subsequent events. And the brain does this to protect us from the overwhelming emotion associated with trauma. But however, this unprocessed trauma then sits just beneath the surface. And it's these sensory fragments that become the triggers for re-experiencing the trauma and, of course, the intense emotion associated with the trauma. So just a sound or an image, a smell, a taste, a touch, or an awareness of a particular part of the body can trigger an overwhelming trauma re-experience and plunge us back into that intense emotion. And so I hope this gives you a sense of why it is so important to be trauma-informed when we're embarking on teaching any mindfulness-based interventions. Because the increased awareness associated with meditation or with mindfulness practice can get our participants in touch with these sensory fragments that lie buried just beneath the surface, and may cause quite dramatic, as in the case of the patient I described at the beginning, re-experiencing which can be highly traumatic and difficult for participants, and can really catch us unawares as MBI practitioners if we're unaware of this and of the risks. And this is particularly true for those of us who've been doing MBSRs and MBIs with body awareness practices. And it's related to what I was saying earlier about the body keeping the score. So what might seem like a simple practice such as a body scan can open participants to re-experiencing trauma. And so it's vital that we are trauma-informed when we embark on teaching any mindfulness practice. And Mbuya and Barbara will say a little bit more about this later on in the session. I just want to make a few points before Barbara, my 10 minutes is up. So just a couple of other points. What else does trauma do to us? So other than the intense re-experiencing that I've spoken of, the kind of flashbacks, trauma can also represent as nightmares. Severe trauma leads to a sense of mental numbing. It can often look like depression. To a sense of dissociation, so perhaps a feeling that I'm not really real, or almost sometimes an out-of-body experience. Or perhaps a feeling that even the world around me isn't real. And then, of course, it leads to avoidance, because, of course, anything that is associated with the trauma, we tend to avoid because it reminds us of the trauma and, of course, may trigger difficult re-experiencing events. And lastly, trauma leads us to a state of hyper-vigilance. So people who suffered severe trauma are constantly scanning the environment for threat. And with that are very easily triggered by minor events. So they're hyper-vigilant, they're on guard, they're on watch. And little things, or seemingly little things, can trigger them. And then lastly, just to say that trauma is cumulative. So repeated trauma leads to what neuroscientists call stress sensitivity. So one trauma makes us more sensitive to future trauma. And so what this can do is make seemingly less severe events more traumatic if they occur on the back of early trauma. And this is particularly the case with early childhood trauma and abuse, which can lead to a perpetual vulnerability to things like mood instability, to hypervigilance, and unpredictable behavior, easily triggered by minor events or by the increased awareness, perhaps, associated with mindfulness practice. So I think, Barbara, I'm going to pause there. And I hope that's provided us with an introduction that we can move forward with. Thank you. I think you muted, Bob.
I am. Thank you. Thanks, Pete. Yeah, that was really interesting. And I know we're going to ask Mbuyiselo if he's got any questions or things to clarify. But one thing that I was just interested in, which seems like a bit of a paradox or a bit of an edge, is that you were talking about trauma being somatized and held in the body, and yet what we do in mindfulness is that we actually come to the body and we come to the senses very explicitly to be more in the present moment. So it's like the very thing that we are trying to cultivate in mindfulness is that could be potentially quite dangerous or life, or sort of feel like life-threatening to people. So I'm just really interested in that sort of almost paradox And I'm just wondering, how you've in your work worked with that dilemma.
Yeah. No, thanks, Barbara. I mean, it is a paradox. And of course, when we embark on mindfulness practice, sometimes we have a belief early on that it's a panacea, that we can treat everything with mindfulness. And I think this is it's really a salutary lesson. But just stepping away, and I said I wasn't going to talk about trauma therapy in detail, but just in broad strokes, all successful trauma therapy involves a form of exposure, of gentle graded exposure. So moving from a safe place and gradually and sensitively and in a controlled fashion, re-experiencing or re-exposing that trauma. Some people put it very nicely when they say remembering, putting it all back together so those sensory fragments join and the narrative memory returns. So in a way, while we may stumble into somebody's trauma inadvertently in a mindfulness practice, it is the beginning of the healing process. So I don't think we must go away with the sense that we mustn't do this. I think it's much more important simply to be aware. Otherwise, you'll stumble like I did into somebody's trauma and be very surprised in your first MBR that something like this has happened.
Yeah, no, thank you. So it's going in carefully. Yeah, thanks, Pete. Mboyi, I don't know if you've got anything you would like to ask Pete or mention.
Yeah, so can you hear me, Barbara?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's not so much of a question, but it's more of a comment. So as Pete was talking, I couldn't help but think about in our community context, how much the young people go through trauma, young people from townships and from rural areas most of the time. So like when Pete was talking about how trauma can affect one's ability to recall. And if I remember correctly, he was talking about the traumatic event itself. So I'm very curious about how maybe trauma affects one's ability to recall, which might affect one's progress at school. And also, like, as he was talking, I was hearing him talk about perceiving, like being in the lookout, on the lookout for danger. And I couldn't help but think about young people that get into the professional world who come from a lot of trauma and how, especially corporate, emphasizes on feedback. So I wonder how like that shows up, like people always being on the lookout for danger, and feedback can be perceived as danger most of the time because the outcome could be the worst, which is maybe losing a job and going back to the traumatic environment when one has made a way out. So those were just all thoughts. I don't know if Pete wants to comment on any of those, or you, Barbara.
Yeah, no, thanks, Mbuyiselo. And I think already you're starting to place this discussion in a community context and in a real local context. And of course, many of our spaces are not safe spaces. Many of our schools are not safe. Kids are at school to the sound of gunshots or gang events and things happening. And if you have a history of trauma and you have the kind of stress sensitivity that I was talking about earlier, it does make learning difficult. And it does impede learning. And I think one of the challenges is that our schools are very poorly equipped to deal with the psychological distress of our kids. There are very few services available within Department of Education. And often these kids only present in extremis when they end up in a hospital casualty or some other dramatic presentation. And so many just fly under the radar. Yeah, so thank you. Thanks for making those points.
Yeah, and I think that's a really nice way of leading into your sharing, Mbuyi, from your experience of working within the different community settings and with the youth that are part of your work. So.
Thank you, Barbara, and thanks, Pete. So when I was asking that question about learning in the school setting, I was also thinking about learning in an MBI, because there's a lot of learning that happens in that space when one is a participant of an MBSR course. So I'm always very curious, even then, how much learning can happen for someone who's been through a lot of trauma in that space, how much they can receive what is being shared in that space by other participants and also by the facilitator. So it's just a point of curiosity for me, because clearly trauma does affect one's learning capabilities. And also, like, there's a capacity thing there, like learning capacity, the ability to recall clearly. There's a lot of distortion that happens. So, like, my name is Mbuyi, full name Mbuyiselo. I was born in Khayelitsha, in Site B Khayelitsha, and my parents decided to move me to the Eastern Cape, me and my brother, older brother, because they saw that a lot of my older brother's friends were starting to get into crime, and there was fear that my older brother was getting into crime as well. And so the decision was that, okay, Khayelitsha was no longer a safe place for us to grow up in. So we moved to the Eastern Cape, and yeah, many of my friends that I grew up with have since passed on. They were involved in gangs, in crime, and yeah, for many different reasons. So I'm one of the people who was born in Khayelitsha, grew up in Khayelitsha a bit, but survived. And surviving, like in the physical sense, even though I moved to the Eastern Cape, I went to a school where they practice corporal punishment. So I quickly realized, that if a teacher was punishing you by whipping and I noticed that it was possible for me. Like, I don't know how I did it, but it was possible for me to just disconnect from my body so that I don't feel the pain. And I kept on doing this, and it was safe for me. I think it connects to what Pete was saying earlier, that the brain dissociates or disconnects because it's doing what's best for us. And in those moments, it did not feel safe. The pain was too unbearable. So there was this disconnection. So that was my experience, my individual experience. But I think we know a lot about the Black body in this country with our history of apartheid. The Black body has been subject to a lot of dominance, being beaten up. I was tempted to do a slideshow for this presentation, but at the same time, I thought it might be too graphic and traumatic to some people in a way. So if you go online and you search Black people during the apartheid, you won't browse for too long up until you see a cop beating up a Black person. So that's what the Black body has been through. I'm talking about the collective. And we know about Steve Vigo, who died from traumas, physical traumas. I think it was brain traumas. He was in a cell, he was detained in a cell, and he died from assault, physical assault. So that's another example of what the Black body has been through. And if we go internationally, we know recently there was the murdering of George Floyd, which just points to this trauma and pain that the Black body has been through. So with all of that said, I'm very curious about how mindfulness focuses on paying attention to the body, when for a lot of people, especially like when I go into the community and I am doing an MBSR and we focus on the body, I notice how difficult that can be for these people that I work with. And it's mostly young people that I work with. And it's because of what that body has been through in the past. So as much as in mindfulness, we talk about, okay, let's bring the attention back to the body is not so safe for some people. And it's the same for me as well. As I was sharing earlier, that I discovered this trick of disconnecting from my body very early on, and learning mindfulness was very uncomfortable for me for a really long time. Even now, sometimes when I try to bring attention to the body, like I can notice the default to just want to move away. So there are some self-care practices that I need to do. I need to remind myself that, okay, there's a gentler way I can do this. It's not just forcing myself into noticing what's happening. And that's helpful when I am teaching in the communities. So that's just on the Black body, and also on noticing body sensations in the practice. And yeah, so as I said, I'm based in Cape Town. I was teaching this other time in the Cape Flats, and there was an interesting incident with we're doing the awareness of breath exercise. So there's this young person who was a participant, and as I was guiding the awareness of breath, when I open my eyes, which is the practice that I do as the person who's guiding, when I open my eyes to look around as to what's happening in the group, I noticed that this young person was agitated and was looking around. I could see that he was not in a good space. And I was very curious. And then I happened to be sitting next to them, and I looked at them just to show them that, okay, I see them. And I had to cut the practice short. And when I gave him an opportunity to reflect, he said, for him, like that silence, that pausing, the room to be silent with no sound, like for him, that felt like the calm before the storm. Because in his area, when there's about to be a shooting, there's just this silence that takes over the whole community. And if you are indoors, like there's just this knowing that the way it's so quiet right now, there's about to be a shooting, because they are used to the shootings. And he said, if you are walking outside in the streets and it's that silent, then you need to be worried, you need to run back home. So for him, sitting in that practice and being too quiet and like just experiencing that silence, that just scared him. Like it just brought about that memory, like of how it's like when he's at home and there's that calm before the storm. And the interesting thing with this young person is that he was enrolled in a program where I was working with the group. Like I kept on working with him, and I could see some improvement. But after a year, he got a job at one of the big companies, tech companies in Pretoria, and he got in touch with me. He had just moved into an apartment in Centurion, and he said, I'm feeling so overwhelmed. This place, I got a new place, and it's supposed to be fantastic, but it's so silent. It feels like how it would feel when we started meditating. And he was just sharing that with me and sharing how it's helpful for him to ground himself and also put to practice some of the practices that we put in place for him. So yeah, that's my 10 minutes, Barbara.
Mbuyi, thank you. I mean, you know, just that your stories just touched me so deeply when I heard them last week when we were meeting, and yet again, it's just my heart is racing as I sit here re-listening to them, and the enormity of what you're speaking about, of what the majority of people in this country have suffered at the hands of cruelty and brutality. And I just want to thank you deeply for bringing this into this forum, because this is our reality. This is the legacy that we're working with. And yeah, thank you for that. And I just would be really, really interested, maybe just to take a moment just to pause and let what you've spoken about and shared just land with us. We may, if it's triggered you in any way, just sort of placing your hand on the part of your body, which maybe brings comfort. And really reflect on these different atrocities that people need to deal with, that both ourselves and witnessing and hearing these stories and knowing the people that themselves have experienced these traumas. This trauma that we kind of swim in. And I would just like to ask you, where you spoke about your own disconnection and from the body as a way of keeping you safe. And you also spoke beautifully about some of the care or practices that you've worked with. And even though today you found some of this uncomfortable, so I don't know if you'd be willing to share some of how you've particularly worked with making yourself feel a bit safe, or if not that, some of the practices that you shared with that young person that found the silence traumatizing, and kind of how you worked with that with him.
So it's helpful to use invitational language when guiding, and instead of saying, okay, right now let's close our eyes, like just making an invitation as to, okay, if it feels safe for you, that keeps it open for the participants, and in particular with the person who was struggling with sound. So we realized that it's really helpful for them to notice the subtlest sounds that they can hear in the room and pay attention to those, even if it's the sound of my voice as I am guiding, or the sound of the person next to them breathing. And once they feel safe, they can redirect back to the silence or to the sensations of the breath on the body. And for me personally, it's helpful to practice kindness towards myself. And this is the language that I try by all means to be sensitive. That's what kindness is to me, like to be sensitive to people's experiences, being curious about what they have been through. So the screenings are very helpful before we start with an MBSR or an MBI intervention, so that one can get an idea of where the participants have been or what they have been through. And like just having conversations and not starting with the practices up until there's a level of psychological safety that has been established, because we might be in the safest room in Cape Town with all the gates closed and in town even, but the memory, like it just has a way of going back to danger. So there's a need to establish some psychological safety and also access to the facilitator, which is me, during the breaks. So if someone is feeling overwhelmed, like they need to know that, okay, during the break, I can go to the facilitator and then I can talk to them about what came up. And I try to make it a point all the time that the people that I'm working with are people that I see on a daily basis, so that we can work on some of the things that are coming up in the classes. So regular checkups are very, very important. And also the dance, Barbara, between looking within and also opening up the attention to other sensations. It could be sound, it could be the visual sensation, like instead of them closing their eyes, it could be helpful for them to focus on a spot on the wall or on the floor. That way, the silence is no longer as deafening, like they are looking at something else.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Mbuyiselo, and sure. Pete, I don't know if something's resonated with you from what Mbuyiselo was sharing.
Yeah, thanks, Mbuyiselo. Thanks for dropping us so beautifully and clearly into the South African reality. Barbara, you put it well. You said this is the trauma in which we swim. And I just wondered, Mbuyiselo, from your experience, because I understand that you are mainly doing group-based work with youth. two questions. The one is, do you find that in the groups, because of the historical or collective trauma, that one person's trauma experience triggers another, so that individuals within the group may trigger one another in the process? And the other is, if you are operating as a single facilitator, what's that like versus perhaps having a second facilitator or someone else in the group to try and help to hold the process?
Yeah, thanks, Pete. So that happens a lot. Someone will share a story about their experience, or like there was one incident in a workshop that I was in. I was not necessarily facilitating it, and someone just said that they don't feel safe anymore in the room because they can feel that the person that they were sharing with are not feeling safe. So that just made them feel unsafe themselves. So it can happen in that way. And I would say, like, to answer your second question, if I'm facilitating by myself, I try as much as I can to keep the group small as it can be, 6 or 7 participants, because it can get really overwhelming. And if it's bigger, like, I need to have someone else in the room, a co-facilitator, to help hold the space. Otherwise, like, it can get really, really overwhelming. So there's a need for skillfulness, experience, and just reiterating this, like, if we are going into a community, I think it's Rebecca Crane who says, be careful not to just parachute into the community. You need to get to know them first and know them well, so that there is trust that is established, and that trust becomes a resource in the long run, because there is safety and there is trust. And the other thing is language. So it's helpful if, let's say, teaching a group that has Afrikaans speaking and Xhosa speaking participants, to have someone with me, a co-facilitator with me, who can speak Afrikaans, just to make the Afrikaans speaking participants feel comfortable, because language goes a long way. I've noticed that sometimes just the English language, for some people, it can be triggering, the way we use the language. So we can use language as a way to establish a bit of safety in the room. So that's how I can answer your question, Pete.
Thanks, Mbuyi. Thank you.
Mbuyi, you speak to me a lot about presence, and your own particular presence, and the care that you have done, your own personal work, and your willingness to be there and go at the pace of the community that you're working with, what's safe for them. So I'm just really struck by the power of your own presence in doing this work, the importance of it. Yeah, so just wanted to reflect back on that. Yeah. So yeah, this part of me doesn't feel like moving on onto sort of talking about more, what happens, how to be more informed, trauma informed, what happens if you're not, after those, the beautiful or poignant illustrations. I've also got messages and that my internet is unstable. I've checked that I'm all connected. So I just want to just check if you can actually hear me. I'm not sure if you can see me very well, but is it all right for me to carry on?
We
Great.
can hear
Okay.
you clearly. Thanks, Barbara.
Pete. Okay, great. Thank you. Right. There are some questions which we'll look at later in the Q&A section. But what I'd like to just share with you is my own experience of when I started teaching and not being trauma-informed, and how I was sort of hit around the head a few times to sort of become more trauma-informed or trauma-aware. And I'm also aware that with Mbuyi, Pete, and myself, both with all three of us being teachers, that we often are speaking about sort of in a teaching context. But what we're also speaking about is also relevant to ourselves. So if you aren't a teacher and you can be looking at this and reflecting on what we're saying it from a personal point of view as well, if you're in your own practice. And so just to hold that while I'm talking, because I will slip into without realizing into sort of from a teaching mode. So so what does a trauma-informed look like, feel like? And so for me, going back to Janine will remember this, one of our first sessions, first trainings that we did, I was very aware that we needed to be really embodied when we guide, and really being present to our own sensations and guiding from what's happening within. And to the right of me, I was very aware of one of our participants who was also a client of mine, been very restless throughout the body scan. And I noticed a sense of quite irritation building up in me, because this guy couldn't stop moving and shifting. And anyway, in the end, when I think I zoned in on him straight away for inquiry, because I think I was really irritated with him. And he was a minister in the police force. And he started really becoming restless right from the word go, when I went to the big left toe. If we all know, we have to go to the big left toe or the big right toe in the body scan. And what this does, what that did for him, and was that he used to have to identify many of the bodies in the mortuary, just as Mbuyi was talking about the brutality of the police and what was happening, and the beatings and the violence in this country. And he had to go and identify people, dead people in the mortuary, and they had tags on their big left toe. And this set up a whole trauma response for him. And here I had been sitting, judging this person of being restless. And I still, actually, as I'm sharing this now, can feel a sort of a heightened sense of a racing heart within me, because of how I so quickly judged this person. And with that, it was such a learning for me, is the whole thing of being not judgmental and being really curious, and also his almost thing of just absolutely staying with the process, even though it wasn't the most kind thing to do, because we didn't invite them to say, well, you could open your eyes or shift or move right in the beginning. We were sort of, in the beginning, really often when we're learning about our practices, we can be quite technical. When we're learning either to be a teacher or you're learning how to meditate. Well, you do a body scan, you do it for 40 minutes and you go through everything, or when you do your sitting meditation, you have to sit in a certain position and you can't move and you need to breathe and you need to get through the whole thing and you have to do 40 minutes. And so we tend to rather focus on the shoulds and how you should meditate, as opposed to actually really turning towards yourself and really working out what is kind and wise and skillful for yourself, as well as for your participants in that moment. So the importance for me of observation and not misreading signs or assuming things based on my own experience, and observing these feelings of people being restless or breathing deeply or shallowly, And as Mbuyi said early on about this coming back to yourself, and then also opening your eyes, possibly if you're guiding, and looking around the room and seeing what's happening in the room, or sensing into the feel of the room, and then also coming back to yourself. So I was really guiding totally from myself and not going from the inside and then checking out and then coming back in. And so that was an invaluable learning. And I still see this man today, and we talk often about that time. And yet, as I learned so much from that experience, he also did about, he didn't have to grit his teeth and just bear with it. He could have actually stopped, and he could have got up, he could have opened his eyes, he could have focused on something else, on an alternate anchor. So that was one of the experiences. And another experience which also took me to realize that focusing on the technical side of things was a young Xhosa woman speaking about her body scan. And, you know, the invitation is you always lie down in a body scan. And so she was really wise in that she said, no, she's not going to lie down, she's going to sit. And this was before I kind of, you know, we spoke often about you could stand as a body scan or sit. But I was thought, oh, okay, she's going to sit. Anyway, in a conversation with her afterwards, like Mbuyiselo was saying, is talking to the participants in between, was she explained, and again, I really felt humbled and a bit ashamed, actually, when she explained that growing up, there were so many of her young friends who were sexually abused, and that her parents, or her mother and her aunts all told you never, ever lie down in a room full of strangers, ever. And so here we are inviting people to make a space to lie down to a body scan, and you inviting memories and experiences of an abusive nature. And so, yeah, with huge humility and sense of, how do I say it, is, yeah, not knowing, and of realizing that I've since then, I've guided and inquired in very different ways. And as we was talking about the invitational side of, you know, you can change postures, you can change positions. You don't have to do it like the book says. Be wise, be kind, be discerning, and don't have to focus on the technical things. And this for me has been so beautifully illustrated in some recent work that and a few of us have been privileged to do with Mark Williams, as he's been working to do, as he's been developing, and we've been piloting for him a follow-on program from mindfulness-based stress reduction, or MBCT, or any MBI, of really sustaining and deepening our practice. And he's really based a lot of his work on the principle that is at the heart of mindfulness, and that's of do no harm, and really holding the safe space for people, which Simon and Linda so beautifully spoke about at our last month, you know, of creating the safe container. And so that people can feel safe and more at ease. And right from the start, the whole thing that Mark was speaking about was giving people permission and explaining to them that we all have difficulties that we're going through, and that it is important for us to take care of ourselves, and sort of really setting the scene for before you start meditating, but not only before we start meditating, but also during the meditation and during the guidance. And so different lengths of practices have been offered, and and also the ability to not only just focus on your breath, because as body scans are normally lying down, sitting meditations, you focus on your breath. It's that sometimes that breath is not the right place to do it. It is more re-traumatizing and difficult. And so it is about exploring other anchors in our bodies that can really help us feel safe and gathered and connected. And so not making it wrong if you're not doing what sort of the typical meditation pose looks like, or the length of what a typical meditation should be like, which a lot of us do carry. For me, this really talks about being trauma informed is actually our responsibility, and it's a kind of speaks to the ethics of this work, and the ethics of doing no harm and creating a sense of safety. So I can talk a lot about all these different aspects, but also the work of David Trevlevin, also, which I know Mark has also drawn on, and many of us met him at David at the conference in 2019, I think, not 2000. And we're hoping that we've invited him David, to join Mandy Johnson at our next learning forum, where he will specifically go into trauma-sensitive practices. So we're really hoping that comes together. It'll be a treat for us. So I just sort of, before I close, my part of it is that our own presence is so important, and our work that we do, the work of our own trauma, of really coming to feel and understand and get the support and help, maybe through therapy or through with what we call a noble friend, and to really sort of do our own work and know our limitations, and obviously our practice which helps ground us. And in our grounding and being present to ourselves and our pain and suffering, we are able more to be there for other people's pain and suffering. And I was chatting to, I think, Anne the other day, and she reminded me of, again, what Mark Williams once shared with us, is that, if someone is tight from tension and like a tight fist, and we try and go in and like sort of and work with that and ask them questions and things like that, they just tighten up around that. But through our presence is a holding kind person to be held or in that, and with that kind, open, accepting and curiosity, that in their own time and own way, each of participants can just sort of open that and sort of unfold and heal in their own way, in their own time. So just those were some of my thoughts and my own experiences with becoming more aware of trauma. And it's an ongoing learning, and learning again from just having spent time with you and Pete and Mbuyiselo, which has been really a treat for me. So I don't know if there's anything that's stimulated for the two of you before we open up to the group.
Yeah, thanks, Barbara, and thanks for sharing from your vast experience over many years. It's also wonderful to hear you talk about the shift from, I can picture you lying on your back trying to do the 45 minutes John Kabat-Zinn body scan to doing a shorter practice sitting up where you can keep an eye on what's going on. I think that's really, really interesting and helpful.
Yeah.
I did have one question for you. Screening. So Mbuyiselo mentioned earlier for him what's really helpful is getting to know his participants or getting to know people or going into an MBI. And I just wondered what advice you had from your experience around screening participants pre-MBSR and perhaps particularly around trauma. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a really important process, and one initially I thought was quite invasive and irritating, asking, and it felt quite uncomfortable. I remember Jenny and I talking a lot about that. Felt quite uncomfortable asking people if they had recent traumas and, any suicidal thoughts. I thought, it's quite sort of, didn't feel respectful. But for me now, it really is very respectful to ask those in sensitive ways and to have discussions with people beforehand, because you spoke about the big T, and there are some big trauma events that if they've happened recently, it's really not advisable to have people at this stage, maybe in a group setting. It doesn't mean to say that it's mindfulness is not for that person, but maybe not in a group setting, maybe one-on-one, which I do quite often, or maybe later. But what I've also learned about the screening is that you can't just say, oh, we've screened that person, tick, tick, everyone's fine, because you spoke beautifully to that cumulative trauma or becoming stress sensitive. And so, I mean, I'd screened that minister who worked in the police force, and he was stable, he was good and everything, and then the big left toe did it. So it was over years and years of that stress that he'd been exposed to that. So it definitely has its place, but don't sit back on your laurels and think, oh, well, that's fine. We're not going to have any trauma in the time. So for me, it's invaluable, and it's not the only thing. I have to use my own sense, my own presence, and my own observational skills, and work with what's emerging, and be grounded in myself when that is emerging. Thanks.
Yeah.
We're going to ask something or check in?
Yeah, just a comment on that. As you are saying it, like just because in the screening stages, someone will say, or people will say they don't have a history of trauma, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not going to come up. Like just from your story that you shared with the woman who was told about sleeping on their back in a room full of people. Recently, I ran an MBSR, and after the second session, I think it was after the second session, we had been doing the body scan. One of the women came to me afterwards, and they requested a one-on-one, which is the space that I create, like that, okay, we can have a debrief afterwards. So she said for her, what the body scan brought up was there was a traumatic event of like she gave birth through C-section, and laying there on her back with a big light coming up from the roof, it just triggered that. And she said she had totally forgotten about that. And when she was doing the body scan, and she said, particularly when we were doing the stomach and she was looking up, she opened her eyes, and then she saw this bright light, and she just went there, straight there. So yeah, just supporting what you're saying there, that just because nothing comes up during the screening, it doesn't mean that nothing will come up in the room. There's still a need to create that space for people to debrief and talk about their experience on a one-on-one basis, because talking about their experiences in the big group can also be very, very difficult for many people, and it's not the best way to go. So there's a need to create that space.
Yeah. Thanks, Mbuyiselo. Absolutely. Sure. I'm just looking at the time, and I'm just thinking it would be really useful to move over to just see if there are any questions or comments in the room. I am seeing that there is one from Donna that I'd like to possibly read out, and then if anyone with voices, we've been hearing 3 voices a lot, and it would be lovely to hear the rest of the community. So while you're thinking of a question or a comment, can I just read out Donna's question to everyone? How do mindfulness facilitators ensure that they might not be triggered during a session? And if a facilitator is triggered, how can we deal with this? Very good question. Pete and Boyd, would you like to speak to that? Or I've got some thoughts as well, but that's a very important question. Yeah. Boyd?
I just wanted to say that it's helpful to have a strong practice for me. Continuing with the practice, a solid practice, like creates space for me to notice when I am triggered. And it's different when I'm aware of the triggering than when I am not, when I'm responding from it. So this practice makes it possible for me to notice, oh, okay, I'm triggered right now, and I can have space for that. And yeah, I can experience it and notice it. But I can see when I'm struggling, when my practice is really struggling, when I'm going through a lot, that I struggle as well. Also struggle, like there's no enough stressing of a solid mindfulness practice for the facilitator as well.
Yeah, thank you. And absolutely, just Donna, definitely as facilitators, I've definitely been triggered many times. And what Mbuyi was saying is that it's my practice that holds me in that space and in that time and helps me through that. And also if I've got a co-facilitator, which is really always very helpful, who sort of knows and can sort of step in if need be. But the one thing that maybe it's a bit of a passion of mine is supervision, is the importance of supervision, because to hold that during the thing is then to actually work with it afterwards and take that into a supervision space, whether it's with a peer supervision or supervision, it's invaluable. And then to do the work with that. So the excellent question, Donna. Thank you very much. Pete, I don't know if you want to add anything before we go to Michael.
Perhaps, thanks, Barbara. Just perhaps one more thing. I think, as we engage in this work, we place a lot of emphasis on our own meditation and mindfulness practice. And perhaps what we don't emphasize enough is dealing with our own demons. And by that, I mean some form of individual therapy. So I think for all of us who engage in this kind of sensitive work with others, there is a responsibility to engage in a therapeutic process so that we as the wounded healers, if I can put it that way, are in a better space to work with those who may be vulnerable and may be traumatized. So there is a responsibility for MBI practitioners to work on that as well.
Yeah, excellent point. Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Michael.
Hi everyone. I've just found this session really, really so useful, and I'm so pleased that I joined. My question is about the structure of the current teachings and how practically we can be flexible to ensure that we are aware of the possible trauma that's sitting in the room, in the group. And yes, I've heard some useful things here, like keep the group small, because you need to be fully aware and present. But the practices are quite structured in that sometimes we will sit in silence for quite some time and we will do the body scans. And my sense, this is not this is just a feeling that pretty much in the room there's more likely to be trauma than not trauma. So if we're holding space, body scans, silence, as we've heard today, just sounds, smells, all of these things. So there could be a lot of things that are being triggered all the time and different things. So are we taking enough of the trauma exposure into account in terms of saying, well, maybe these practices need to change in a way, or be more flexible, or our invitation at the practice to be saying, look, this is the practice that we want to invite you to participate in. However, if it doesn't work for you, just be safe, like get up, walk away, and I don't think, so I feel like we need to be doing more of that, more of inviting people to and your words earlier about doing no harm. People need to be safe first before following a structured process. And yes, over time we may see some ability to stay in a practice for longer, but in our country in particular, we're going to be dealing with trauma more than not, and so I feel like we need to be specifically incorporating adaptation to our practices around that. So that was just a question, do we do that, and is it the current thinking that we need to be more open and more flexible in terms of the practices?
Sure, Michael, all very, very relevant and very important points that you're raising up, and just General Michael's, currently on the teaching program now. So I think it's really relevant what you're asking, and it is something that is definitely being threaded more into the trainings and the teachings and the awareness and the research. And as you said, the invitational aspect of it, and the do no harm, and the ethical responsibility, and that is why we invited people like David Trevleven to speak to us, and we'll be, and there's definitely working with the curricula of the program, which has been re-looked at the moment at Brown University, and will be actually updated with more trauma-informed practices. So there's an incredible global awareness with this, but at the same time to keep the integrity of the work. So the structures of the meditations and practices is steeped in a sort of in a lineage and a foundation, as how can we keep the integrity of that and yet work with what people are bringing and where they are at. And so that's the sensitivity to working with that. And but absolutely, first do no harm, and then the safe environment. And then we will be exploring more and more, and in our next forum talking about looking at those practicalities of how we can do the very thing that we're speaking about. Yeah, thank you. I'm just seeing there's something else from Mike. There's a question. Okay, Mike's question is, I'm currently running 2 courses concurrently in a dysfunctional organization where there's a very high distress factor, and the trauma is currently happening. So it's actually happening in the moment. Any thoughts? Wow, okay. The first thought that comes up to me, Mark, is what support are you getting? Yeah, so that was the first thing that comes up for me. So Mbuyi or Pete, is anything that comes to mind for you before? I can't see you, Mark. Obviously, you're on a different page to me. Oh, there you are. Great. Hi, welcome. Nice to see you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Would you like to talk a little bit more to that, Mike?
I was aware of a level of dysfunctionality before I commenced the courses. It's an MBI with a focus on resilience. And everything went fine in the first 2 sessions, but by the time I got to the 3rd session, where although I'm covering mind, body, and emotions all the time, the particular focus is on emotions. And suddenly the group became rather tearful, and after the conversation and the inquiry afterwards, I realized that in fact it was actually a group in trauma. Over the current circumstances in which the management are just getting things terribly wrong. It was a scary moment, but I thought I must like Mbui said, stick to the process. This is what we're here for. This is our intention. We'll keep working on it. But as the traumas arise, I will just coach you on managing it. And so when we go into a meditation, for instance, I will remind them now there is the possibility that this trauma could arise. So when it does, or if it does, this is what you do. And I give them various instructions. The first thing is open your eyes. Look around you, and then get to the breathing. Just watch your breathing, and to try and keep a. So that's basically what I do. Yeah. It's been your first question was the most challenging. It has been very demanding on me personally. I do have two very good consultants, if you like, that I can turn to and that I have in order to do my own sort of debriefing, because I was very aware of myself becoming angry. And I actually had a client after a course who's a guy struggling with an addictive problem. And I found a level of harshness in my counseling with him that it was as if the voice that I was hearing wasn't mine, and the words I was using weren't mine. So that was a big warning sign to me. Excuse me. And I immediately contacted one of my consultants, and we were able to work through it quite well. Yeah.
I think, Mike, that's a beautiful example of you working skillfully with the participants about, giving them a heads up, and then also some tactics of what to do, but also really skillful to really own and see what was coming up for you, and actually being accountable and actually doing what you needed to do. Yeah. Thank you for bringing those two components up. It also just reminds me of one thing that as mindful practitioners, that sometimes we need to have a bit of an advocacy role. And I'm just wondering, and there's no time to really go into answering the question, but just the thought was, is there an advocacy role of going to management or of the organizations within which this is happening? So
you're right. I'm currently in avoidance, but it's got to happen. It's got to happen.
I love it. So really naming and seeing where you're at, engaging where you at. That's beautiful. Well, good luck when you step out there, and good luck to managers as well for when you do that.
Well, if I could just come in for a moment, because I think what Mike's raising is a real challenge, that many of us are being drawn into offering MBIs within corporates or government or business on the back of, well, people are stressed and burnt out, and a mindfulness program would be really helpful. But of course, as Mike's saying, the reason that people are stressed and burnt out is usually because of the system's failures within the organization. And so one of the challenges for those who then engage in this work is what do we do about systems change? Because here we are running a mindfulness program. And are we just putting a Band-Aid on the problem, and not getting to the cause? So I think that at some point there has to be some discussion around a wise action in the process, because this isn't just about developing the capacity to cope with all the systemic trauma. It's really about gathering in the mindful space the wisdom about what is the next wise step, and what might be the small systems changes that I can engage with as an employee or a member And I think it's a real dilemma, because often we're in the employ of management in offering these programs, and yet it becomes abundantly clear that the problem lies within. So, Mike, I resonate with you. It's a challenge.
Thanks, Pete. And Mbuyi, I just would love to invite you if there's anything you'd like to say in closing as we bring the evening to a close.
No, there's nothing much from me. Just I love the way that Pete closed that loop. I think we really need to be aware of the bigger picture here. South Africa, there's so much inequality in South Africa, and whenever we are called into corporate business or we're working in communities, there needs to be a goal in sight, whether it's connecting young people to real opportunities or it's challenging the systems that have been put in place that are disadvantaging the young people or the people at large. So yeah, just want to echo what Pete was saying just now. It's not just about building capacity to withstand the trauma. It's about also making change. There's a wise action that needs to happen ultimately. So yeah, that's it from me.
Yeah, thank you, Mbuyiselo. Thank you, Pete, and thank you to each one of you for being present. It's encouraging to know there are so many, or in this community, that are committed to this practice for ourselves, but it's also in service of others and in service of suffering in this world. And yeah, I feel blessed to be part of this community. And thank you to Misa for this space. And we look forward to seeing you next month, hopefully with David and joined by Mandy. And so we'd just really like to pause in silence and just to leave with some words that I just wanted to share earlier on by Kahil Gibran. So let's just go into silence or settle your attention into a place where you feel comfortable. And as you go out and do this work for yourself and in the communities that you serve, just these words may just help. And Kahil talks about, may there be kindness in your gaze as you look within. May there be kindness in your gaze as you look within. So as you look within yourself, but as you look within in others, may there be kindness. So thank you and enjoy the rest of your evening and see you next month.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it deeply.
Thanks, Anne.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you, Barbara and Mbuyiselo and Pete. Very beautiful.
Thanks, Vera. Lovely to have you.